My boss took credit for my work on stage, in front of everyone. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I let him finish. Because the moment he claimed it publicly, his future was already sealed. If you've ever been quietly used, overlooked, or erased by someone who benefited from your effort, take a second to like, comment, or share this. You're not alone, and this story is for you. I've never been the loud one in the room. Not at work, not in my family, not anywhere that rewarded noise over consistency. I was the dependable one, the man who arrived early, stayed late, fixed problems before they became visible, and didn't need credit to feel useful. Or at least, that's what I told myself for a long time. I worked as a senior analyst at a mid-sized tech consultancy. Not glamorous, not startup famous, but stable, respected, and demanding in the way that quietly consumes your life if you let it. I was good at what I did, good enough that people stopped double-checking my work and started assuming it would always be right. That was my first mistake. My boss, Martin, liked to call me his right hand. He said it often, usually in meetings, always with a friendly smile. People nodded. It sounded like praise. It felt like validation. But right hand really meant something else. It meant I built the frameworks, and he delivered the conclusions. I wrote the strategies, and he spoke the summaries. I stayed invisible so he could stay impressive. At first, I didn't mind. I believed in hierarchy. I believed that loyalty would be noticed eventually. I believed that if I kept my head down and my output high, recognition would come naturally. That belief didn't come from work alone. It came from home. Growing up, I was the responsible son, the one who didn't need reminders, the one who didn't cause trouble. My younger siblings were louder, more demanding, more visibly needy. I was praised for being easy, which I later learned was just another word for convenient. When my parents needed help, they called me. When something broke, I fixed it. When money was tight, I adjusted my life quietly so no one else had to. No one ever asked if I was okay with that arrangement. It was simply understood. So when Martin started leaning on me more heavily, at work signing complex projects with impossible timelines, asking me to just take care of it while he handled the optics, it felt familiar. Uncomfortable, but familiar. And familiarity can be dangerous. The project that changed everything began innocently enough. A new enterprise client, high profile, high stakes, the kind of account that could accelerate a career raw end one. Martin called me into his office late on a Friday. "I need you on this," he said, sliding a thin folder across the desk. "You're the only one I trust to get it right." Trust. Another word that feels good until you examine it closely. I reviewed the brief over the weekend. By Monday, I saw the gaps, the risks, the unrealistic expectations the sales team had promised. I didn't panic. I did what I always did: built a solution. Over the next 6 weeks, I lived inside that project. I mapped systems, ran simulations, anticipated failure points before anyone else noticed them. I sent Martin detailed updates. He replied with short acknowledgements, thumbs up emojis. "Great work. Exactly what we need. This will impress them." What he never said was thank you. What he never did was include me in the meetings with the client. Whenever I asked, he'd smile and say, "I'll handle the presentation. You focus on the substance." Substance. Optics. At home, something similar was happening. My family had started planning a major event, one that required time, coordination, and money. Without discussion, responsibilities began landing on my shoulders. I was added to group chats after decisions were made, asked to contribute after budgets were set, expected to adjust my schedule because you're flexible. When I tried to push back gently, I was met with confusion. "You've always handled things," my mother said. "You're just better at this stuff," my brother added. "It's not a big deal," someone else chimed in. That phrase, "it's not a big deal," followed me everywhere. At work, at home, inside my own head. By the time the project was complete, I was exhausted, but proud. The solution was solid, elegant, legally sound, scalable. It addressed every concern. The client hadn't even realized they had yet. I sent Martin the final deck late one night. He replied the next morning with a single sentence. "This is perfect. I'll present it to the board on Thursday." No invitation. No acknowledgement of authorship. No hint that my presence was required. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Something in me shifted, not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. Like a door closing without a sound. For the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt alert. Because when someone shows you how easily they can erase you, the smartest thing you can do isn't to protest. It's to pay attention. Thursday arrived faster than I expected. Not because time moved quickly, but because I wasn't invited to slow it down. I found out about the presentation the same way I found out about most things that excluded me, indirectly. A junior colleague mentioned it casually while pouring coffee. Big day for Martin, she said. Board presentation, right. This could put him in line for the regional role. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her whose work it was. I didn't even react. I just nodded and stirred my coffee until it went cold. The presentation happened on the top floor, glass walls, long table, the kind of room designed to make people feel important. I wasn't supposed to be there. My calendar was intentionally empty that afternoon, as if my time had suddenly lost value. Instead of watching from the hallway or joining remotely like an afterthought, I did something else. I worked. Not on new tasks. Not on distractions. I reviewed everything I had already submitted: emails, drafts, version histories, timestamped files. I wasn't suspicious yet. Not fully. But a quiet part of me wanted clarity. And clarity often lives in documentation. At exactly 2:17 p.m., my phone buzzed. A photo. Someone had posted it in the internal Slack channel reserved for company wins. Martin stood at the head of the table, mid-sentence, hands open, in a practiced gesture of confidence. Behind him, projected on the screen, was the opening slide. The framework I designed. The wording I refined. Even the visual hierarchy of the color emphasis. The pacing of the reveal was unmistakably mine. My name was nowhere on the slide. The caption read, "Incredible strategic vision from Martin today. This is the future of how we scale." Applause emojis followed. Fire icons. Congratulatory messages from people who had never once asked me how the project was going. I closed the app. Not because I was angry, but because I needed silence to think clearly. The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't come with insults or confrontation. It came polished, professional, clean. That's what made it dangerous. Later that evening, Martin called me. "Great news," he said, voice buoyant. "The board loved it. They were really impressed." I waited. He didn't say my name. They had a few follow-up questions. He continued. "Mostly technical, but I handled them. You built something very adaptable." "I'm very adaptable." "Sounds like it went well," I said calmly. There was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible, as if he'd expected something else. Gratitude, maybe. Excitement. Pride. "Yeah," he replied. "Listen, things are moving fast now. I'll need you to stay flexible over the next few weeks." This could mean big things for the team. The team, not me. I realized then that he wasn't nervous. He wasn't apologetic. He didn't think he had done anything wrong. In his mind, this was how things worked. I was the engine. He was the driver. And drivers rarely thank engines. That night, I went home and sat alone in my apartment. Lights off. City noise humming through the windows. I replayed the moment on stage in my head, not with anger, but with distance. I asked myself a simple question. If I say nothing, what happens next? The answer came quickly. More of the same. More erasure disguised as leadership. More praise that stopped one step short of my name. So I made a decision. Not to confront him. Not to demand credit. Not to vent to colleagues or complain to HR in a burst of emotion. I decided to watch. To let him continue. To let him grow comfortable. To let him believe the story he was telling everyone, that he was the architect, not the messenger. Because people who take credit for work they don't fully understand always reveal themselves eventually. They just need time. And I had plenty of it. Once Martin tasted recognition, he changed, not dramatically, not in ways that would raise alarms. He became bolder. Meetings he once delegated, he now dominated. He spoke with certainty about systems he didn't fully grasp, using my language but flatter, less precise. When questions went deeper, he smiled and deflected. "We'll circle back on that," he'd say. That's being refined internally. Internally, which meant me. My workload doubled, then quietly tripled. Requests came faster, deadlines tighter. He stopped asking if I could handle something and started assuming I already had. "You're good under pressure," he told me once, as if it were a compliment instead of a warning. What changed most wasn't the work. It was the way people looked at me. Colleagues who once treated me as a peer now saw me as support, a resource. Someone to check with before taking things to Martin. "Oh, Martin mentioned you might have the details." They'd say, mentioned, not credited. I corrected no one. At home, the pattern echoed. The family event planning had turned chaotic. Decisions were being made without consultation, yet consequences were landing squarely in my lap. Costs ran over budget. Timelines slipped. And when things didn't go smoothly, frustration pointed in my direction. You didn't remind us, my sister said. You should have caught that, my brother added. You're usually better organized, my mother sighed. Usually, I noticed how easily responsibility slid downhill always toward the person least likely to protest. When I did try to explain, calmly and clearly, I was met with confusion that bordered on irritation. Why are you being so sensitive? It's not that deep. Don't make this a big thing. That was gaslighting in its softest form. Not denying facts, but minimizing impact. Teaching you that your discomfort was the real problem. At work, the escalation became more strategic. Martin began looping other executives into conversations about his project. He positioned himself as the visionary, leading a transformation, while subtly implying that execution details were handled by his team, plural, nameless. One afternoon, I was pulled into an impromptu meeting with legal and compliance people who didn't usually attend early-stage discussions. They asked pointed questions about data usage, about risk exposure, about contractual interpretations. I answered carefully, truthfully. I cited the safeguards I had built in, the limitations I had clearly documented. Martin nodded along, adding commentary that sounded confident but lacked substance. At one point, a compliance officer turned to him and asked, "And who authored this framework?" The room went still. Martin smiled easily. "I led the strategy, not we, not my team. I no mention of my name even, when prompted. I felt something then, not anger, not even disappointment. Clarity, because that moment told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't corporate politics. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional." After the meeting, Martin pulled me aside. "Great job in there," he said. "You really saved us. Saved us. I'll need you to draft a follow-up memo addressing their concerns." Tight turnaround, I nodded. But something had changed in how I listened. I started noticing patterns. He forwarded my emails to executives without context, sometimes editing them slightly, just enough to sound like his voice. He paraphrased my recommendations verbally, stripping away nuance, then came back to me when his version raised complications. "You might want to tweak the model," he'd say. They had questions. They never him. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating. Someone hinted that I wasn't a team player because I didn't speak up more in meetings. Another suggested I lacked ambition, that I was comfortable supporting leadership rather than leading. That one made me pause, because it wasn't true. I wasn't unambitious. I was contained. The narrative was shifting quietly from dependable expert to background operator. And narratives, once set, are hard to reverse unless you interrupt them strategically. At home, the event finally happened. It was disorganized, over budget, stressful, and when something went wrong, publicly scheduling conflict. An oversight. I felt eyes turn toward me. "You were handling that, right?" Someone asked, not accusingly, just assuming. I looked around the room at faces that had grown comfortable with my silence. And for the first time, I said nothing. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I didn't rush to fix it. I let the discomfort sit where it belonged. The reaction was immediate. Confusion, then irritation, then subtle resentment. At work, a similar moment arrived. Martin had promised the board a feature expansion on a timeline that was optimistic. He hadn't checked with me first. The email went out company-wide, deadlines announced, expectations set. He stopped by my desk later that day. "We'll need to accelerate a bit," he said casually. I told them it was doable. I met his eyes. "It's not," I said, calmly. He blinked. "Well, we'll figure it out." "No," I replied. "We won't." It was the first time I had ever contradicted him openly. The room didn't explode. No voices were raised. But something cracked. He stared at me for a moment longer than necessary, then smiled thinly. "Let's discuss offline." Offline became colder after that. He stopped including me on emails entirely, then blamed me for being out of the loop. He hinted to HR that I was resistant to change. He framed my boundaries as attitude. Still, I stayed calm, because I had stopped reacting emotionally and started preparing structurally. I archived emails, saved drafts, tracked changes. I reviewed my contract, my job description, the intellectual property clauses I had once skimmed without concern. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was reclaiming leverage. The situation continued to deteriorate, not because I pushed, but because Martin did. He overpromised, he underdelivered, and without my quiet corrections, smoothing the edges, cracks became visible. Questions came faster. Confidence wavered. The room grew less forgiving. And then, one morning, I received an email that crossed a line so cleanly, so decisively, that it removed all remaining doubt. A request written, documented, undeniable. One that made it clear this was no longer about credit. The email arrived at 7:12 a.m., not marked urgent, not flagged. Just another clean, professional message, sitting quietly in my inbox. Subject: framework, ownership, and transition. I opened it slowly, already sensing that this wasn't routine. Martin had CC'd HR, legal, and a regional director I'd never interacted with directly. That alone told me this wasn't a conversation. It was a declaration. The message was carefully worded too. Carefully, he thanked me for my contributions to the project, acknowledged my technical support, and then stated that, moving forward, all strategic frameworks related to the client would be consolidated under his leadership for consistency and clarity. Then came the sentence that changed everything. To avoid confusion, please confirm in writing that all materials created to date fall under my strategic authorship, as outlined in my role. I read it twice, then a third time. He wasn't just taking credit anymore. He was asking me to retroactively surrender authorship to erase myself formally, legally, and permanently. And he wanted it in writing. That was the line. Not because it threatened my job, though it did. Not because it insulted me, though it was insulting. But because it required my participation in my own erasure. For the first time since this began, I felt something sharp rise in my chest. Not rage. Resolve. I leaned back in my chair and let the feeling pass. I didn't respond. I didn't forward it. I didn't ask anyone for advice. I simply thought. I thought about every late night, every assumption that I'd handle it, every moment I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. At work, at home, everywhere. This wasn't just Martin. This was a pattern I had allowed because it felt easier than disruption. But clarity has a way of simplifying things. I realized something important in that moment. I didn't want revenge. I wanted alignment between my effort and my worth, my contribution and my recognition, my boundaries and my behavior. And alignment requires action, not confrontation. Action. I replied to the email an hour later. Brief, professional, non-emotional. I'm happy to discuss future ownership structures. However, I can't confirm authorship for work I independently created. Let me know a time to review documentation if needed. No accusations, no defensiveness, just truth. The response came faster than I expected. Martin called. I didn't answer. He called again. I let it ring. Then a message. This doesn't need to be complicated. That was the phrase people used when they wanted compliance without scrutiny. I forwarded the original email and changed to my personal archive and continued working as if nothing had happened. The next few days were tense, but quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when I entered rooms. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. HR sent a polite request to check in the following week. At home, something similar happened. A financial issue surfaced related to the family event. A cost overrun no one wanted to own. I was added to a message thread already heavy with frustration. You were overseeing this. Someone wrote. I wasn't. I never had been. This time, I responded calmly. Publicly, clearly. I wasn't responsible for that decision, or that payment. I wasn't consulted. Silence followed. Then discomfort. Then someone tried to smooth it over. Let's not point fingers. But that was the problem. No one wanted responsibility, only benefit. That night, sitting alone again, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace, not relief, not victory. Peace. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was being accurate. At work, HR eventually scheduled the meeting. Martin was there, so was legal. The conversation was polite, structured, procedural. Martin framed the issue as a miscommunication. He suggested I was being protective of work that had been created collaboratively. I listened without interrupting. Then I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend my character. I presented facts. Time-stamped drafts. Version histories. Emails assigning me sole responsibility. Internal messages, where Martin explicitly asked me to build the entire framework. I didn't accuse, I documented. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Legal asked follow-up questions. HR took notes more carefully. Martin stopped smiling. No decision was made that day. But something irreversible happened. The narrative broke. At home, boundaries held to when another issue surfaced weeks later. I wasn't contacted. For the first time, I wasn't assumed, and that absence spoke louder than any apology. I understood then that forgiveness had never been the goal. Respect was. And respect doesn't come from explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. It comes from stepping back and letting consequences move forward without interference. Justice rarely announces itself. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. It doesn't demand attention. It waits until systems collide with truth and then it lets gravity do the rest. After the HR meeting, nothing dramatic happened. No apologies. No sudden reversals. No satisfying moment where someone admitted wrongdoing. Instead, there was silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that comes when people are recalculating. Martin stopped calling. Emails that once came directly from him now came through intermediaries. Carefully worded and noticeably cautious. Legal requested additional documentation for record completeness. Compliance followed up with clarifying questions that seemed small on the surface, but revealed deeper concern underneath. I answered everything promptly, accurately, without commentary. I didn't volunteer opinions. I didn't push conclusions. I let the paper speak, because paper never forgets. Over the next few weeks, the project began to strain under its own weight. Without my quiet corrections happening in the background, Martin's version of the framework started to wobble. Clients asked questions he couldn't answer cleanly. Executives requested deeper breakdowns he hadn't prepared for. Timelines slipped not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. Each delay required explanation. Each explanation created scrutiny, and scrutiny is where borrowed authority tends to collapse. I was invited formally this time to join a follow-up review with the client's technical team. Martin wasn't on the invite. That detail mattered. The meeting was calm, professional, focused. I walked them through the architecture as I had originally designed it, precise, grounded, transparent about limitations. They listened. They asked intelligent questions. They trusted the answers. At the end, the lead client representative said something simple. This aligns much better with what we were promised. Not who promised it. Just that it finally did. After the call, I received a separate email from legal. They thanked me for my clarity and cooperation. Then they asked one final question. Carefully phrased, for confirmation, did you at any point formally assign authorship or ownership of the framework to another individual? I replied with a single sentence. No, that was it. 2 weeks later, Martin was reassigned, not fired, not disgraced, just moved, a lateral shift to a role with less visibility, fewer client-facing responsibilities, and a narrower scope. Officially, it was described as a strategic realignment. Unofficially, everyone understood what it was. Trust, once questioned, is rarely restored in leadership roles. No announcement was made about the framework's authorship. There didn't need to be. My name simply began appearing where it always should have. On documents, on agendas, on invitations. Quietly, at home, something similar unfolded. Without me smoothing over details, fixing oversights, or absorbing blame, the family dynamic shifted. Responsibilities became visible when they were no longer invisible. Mistakes were owned awkwardly at first. Plans were reconsidered. Assumptions were corrected. No one apologized. But they adjusted. An adjustment, I learned, is often more honest than words. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter. Because the justice hadn't come from winning. It had come from stepping out of the way and letting people experience the full weight of their choices, without my intervention, cushioning the impact. That was the real revenge, not punishment. Absence. The strange thing about regaining your place is realizing how little you want to stay where you were. After Martin's reassignment, opportunities opened quietly. I was invited into rooms I'd never been allowed to enter before, not as support, not as backup, but as a decision maker. My input was sought early, not after promises had already been made. Still, something in me resisted settling back in, not because the company was broken, but because I had changed. For years, I had measured my worth by how much I could carry without complaint. I thought being indispensable meant being invisible. I believed stability came from endurance. But endurance without respect is just slow. For erasure, I began to set boundaries that felt uncomfortable at first. I declined unreasonable deadlines without apology. I asked clarifying questions before accepting responsibility. I documented expectations not defensively, but deliberately. And something unexpected happened. People respected it. Not everyone liked it, but they respected it. At home, I made similar changes. I stopped stepping in automatically. I asked before committing time or money. I let silence replace my reflex to rescue. There were moments of tension, awkward pauses, adjustments that felt unnatural to everyone involved. But there was also relief. Because when you stop over-functioning, you give others permission to step up or step away. Either way, the truth becomes visible. One evening, months later, I walked past a new mural near my apartment. It hadn't been there before, a large, understated piece painted along a concrete wall. It showed a figure standing slightly apart from a crowd, not elevated, not spotlighted, just grounded. The expression wasn't angry or proud. It was calm, centered. The caption beneath it read, "Presence is power." I stood there longer than I meant to, because that was a lesson I had learned the hard way. Power isn't loud. It doesn't demand credit. It doesn't rush to explain itself. Power is knowing when to speak and when to let systems reveal the truth for you. I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't expose secrets. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stopped participating in my own diminishment, and the world adjusted accordingly. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been taken for granted, erased quietly, or made to feel replaceable, share your experience in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about betrayal, boundaries, and quiet justice. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's building a life where they no longer get access to you at all.